So you have Baltic funds focused on the Baltics, German funds in Germany, UK defense funds focusing on the UK. We wanted to have a pan-European approach where a German company can scale. We can open doors in Estonia, to the United Kingdom, and then broadly to the United States. We wanted to have a sort of unified approach, and startups seem to like that idea because the scalability is there.
Welcome to PEP, the Protect Europe podcast, where we interview founders and investors building the technology that protects Europe's values, way of life, and infrastructure. Okay, Vishal, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here. So let's dive in. Tell me about Defence Invest. Tell me about that.
Sure. So we're a defense-only and dual-use sort of investment fund focusing on capturing opportunities in Europe. I guess what sort of differentiates us is that we focus mainly on the sort of Series A to Series B stage with a few select seed investments. The whole team have a military background, so we have people from the Royal Air Force, an army. I've got a German Special Forces member. So we wanted to sort of build a team where everybody has a different sort of capability. And we wanted to look at sort of defense investments from a proper defense lens. I think with sort of the markets maturing, it's less about the technology. It's more about will an MOD accept this? Will this survive procurement with the defense prime? And that's sort of where we saw the gap in the market in terms of us being an investment fund. In the investment side of things, we've got a defense tech VC experience across Europe, the United States, and Israel. We've got private equity experience. And in the cybersecurity side, we've got some commercial experience as well. So we wanted to tap into all these different skill sets to create a dedicated fund in defense. So we're comfortable with dual use investments as well as defense only investments. And I guess that's why the name is Defense Invest, because defense is all we do.
Okay. Despite living in Helsinki, I am British, so I'm big on calling a spade a spade. Because it is, right? So if you're going to invest in defense, right? So I think one of the challenges, a number of funds that have come to market recently have kind of done we're dual use, kind of defense, but caveat. I love your approach, which is very clear. We are a team that basically has defense expertise and backgrounds. That's our superpower. And we're going to invest in defense, right? And then it doesn't mean that you're ruling out dual use, but you're not kind of trying to greenwash defense into something that it isn't, which I think is really, really to applaud it. So let's just dig in a little bit into the team because it sounded fascinating. So let's just name some names. Who's in the team and kind of how did you guys meet? Because I think that's also super interesting when you talk about whether it's a company team that you've invested in or an investment team that you're kind of forming together. It's the kind of how does this battle-tested, pardon the pun, team come together?
Sure. So I guess in terms of the GP, the sort of the day-to-day people, it's myself and my co-founder, Matt Cuppers. So Matt's background is he ran a successful sort of startup consultancy called Startup Manufactory out of London. He was sort of helping at the time fintech companies commercialize, raise venture capital and sort of scale up. And from that, he moved into the European Union ecosystem as an expert mentor for a lot of EU accelerators. He also then joined the German army.
Because he didn't have enough to do. He didn't have enough to do. He was bored.
Exactly that. Like, I don't know how he does it, but he was a full-time reservist. And I guess what makes him very interesting is within the German army, he was actually in a defense innovation unit. So they were testing really advanced technologies, working with defense primes in Germany. So he really got to understand the different stakeholder management that's involved in defense. A lot of people in the industry just have defense experience, but he actually has the innovation experience, which is sort of what makes him sort of unique. My background was more of the investment side. Out of university, I joined after a few years at a hedge fund. I joined a cybersecurity venture capital company. This was based in the States, so our sort of mission objective was finding technologies coming out of the Central Intelligence Agency or the sort of broader US national security community and commercializing those technologies. We did that for a few years, and then everything sort of changed with the Ukraine invasion. So we decided we wanted to sort of look at Europe as an opportunity, as well as go from cyber to defense tech sort of overall. I then moved back to London to, I guess, focus on the European expansion. I guess from that, I sort of met my co-founder, Matt, and we had this idea of creating a pan-European sort of firm. So myself and Matt are the sort of the day-to-day people. And
that makes a lot of sense. And just out of interest, you probably haven't read it. I've just finished reading The Hacker and the State, which is basically a book talking about taking what happens with, NSA, etc., and how many of the assets came out and how are they used, etc., etc. So, what you just described is what I've just read over the last month. Okay, so now tell us about the other team. You're the GPs.
Sure.
Who else is involved?
So we've got a professor in the Netherlands, a former British Royal Air Force officer. He is an expert in sort of navigating the European Union grant system. He's been an academic for his sort of professional career. So he advises startups for getting EU grants, how to navigate them, as well as sort of test their sort of business ideas, mainly on the earlier stage of things. We've got a senior military professional from the German forces who was a military attaché. We've also got a German special forces cyber expert who worked in the commercial sector. So that's sort of the broader team. And we're looking to sort of expand, having a few other sort of, I guess, junior staff members to help us sort of go through due diligence and sort of close deals.
Oh, look, I am very clear on how a good investment firm works. And for me is you have to have this strong chemistry kind of between the GPs. You have to kind of be, brothers in arms kind of relationship with your partners. And then potentially with those kind of wider people, the venture partners, however you're describing them, the people who aren't living it necessarily day to day because they have a day job, they've got to be the best in their swim lane, right? So, when you sit down with a company and say, hey, we've got X and he's going to be helping you with defense procurement, they're like, you've got X on your team? Like him or her, the best person in Europe to help my company navigate these procurement challenges? Not quite where do I sign, but it's a lean in conversation, not a who conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of big differentiator is like there's a lot of defense funds out there. There's a lot of capital in Europe. But what our experiences when we talk to startups are, we have these connections with primes. We know how MOD procurement actually works, and defense is still very much circles of trust. Yeah. If you're in the if you're in the industry, you sort of know how it works. If you're from the outside, and no matter how much capital you have, it's very difficult to break into defense. And I think what we're finding now is you have some startups with no defense experience, sort of having trouble. They have great technologies, but it might not actually be a fit for the military. It might not actually have any strong defense applications. They're sort of at this roadblock. And I guess for us, one thing that we've found quite good is we have sort of a lot of companies are in stealth mode because of the nature of defense. We have those guys reach out to us saying specifically want to work with us because of our connections across Europe. I guess the other sort of broader differentiator is, especially Europe, is very siloed. So you have Baltic funds focused on the Baltics, German funds in Germany, UK defense funds focusing on the UK. Yeah. We wanted to have a pan-European approach where a German company can scale. We can open doors in Estonia, to the United Kingdom, and then broadly to the United States. We wanted to have a sort of unified approach, and startups seem to like that idea because the scalability is there. And with our team sort of placed everywhere, we can open the right doors at the right times.
Look, I completely agree. I think I would love Europe to be more cohesive, coordinated, whatever words we want to use that basically mean functioning market. I think particularly in defense, and particularly, as you said, those circles of trust, it's super important that you can help them sell to the government, help them sell to the prime. Because actually, when you look at it, I'd be really interested in your take on this. I think the defense ecosystem, despite, NATO pledges and the breadth of that, it's still ironically a very immature ecosystem, or it feels like an immature ecosystem. You've got like tiny little startup, we've just invented this cool capability, who wants it? And then you have these kind of, the big OEM type prime aspects, Rheinmetall, et cetera. And then kind of like there's not a lot in between, right? Yeah. And the OEMs guys, we're German, we do Germany, we have relationship here, or we're Finnish, we do Finnish, or we're Polish, we do Polish. And then it makes it super hard for ye scrappy startup with interesting capability to connect, to sell, to build, to scale, to even get a relationship in the first place. Is that your take on it, or do you see something different in Europe?
So I completely agree. It's a very early ecosystem. There's you have a lot of smart people coming with great technologies, but they just don't know how to navigate procurement side of things. Again, great technologies for what you think is strong for military application doesn't actually mean the military actually want it. There's a lot of hypotheticals, a lot of noise out there, and everybody wants to move into this space because it seems so attractive right now. I think what I expect to see is, say, primes would probably have their own corporate venture arms. These sort of warfare sort of changed where a few $100s on a drone can do as much of an impact as tens of millions spent on a tank. It's become quite equalizing that in that aspect. And I think defense primes are looking at these startups, they either for acquisition opportunities or for partnership opportunities. I think that gap will begin to close. For now, it's a very nascent ecosystem. But one of the great things about it is all the different participants are very collaborative. So we talked to other defense funds, government partners, startups, and everybody wants to work with each other, which is very nice to see for I guess for a venture capital ecosystem.
Oh, absolutely. And probably the antidote to fintech. Fintech early days was fine, but fintech later days, no, we don't want to talk to the other guys, etc. I think that's right. I think it's interesting to say, look, it's nascent, it's early, which again, you're running an investment vehicle. So your LPs are going to be interested in that investment return. There's some degree of kind of patriotic capital or national capital where I'm investing for the right reasons, but I'm still investing. So how do you paint the picture around the sort of returns that you will be able to give them in this space? Because part of it is it's early, so therefore there can be some good returns. And the downside of the it's early is it might be too early on that side. How do you square that with LPs? What sort of questions do they fire at you on that basis?
Sure. So, like with defense, because sales cycles are probably the longest sales cycle in any sort of venture capital sector, we always go to LPs and say, look, we can open the right doors, but these things take time. But the great thing about defense is as soon as you have a contract with an MOD or with a prime, you've got this sort of secured contract, you've got cash coming in each year, you've de-risked the business almost instantaneously. I look at defense more as a private equity play. You have this great technology. As soon as you have a few contracts, it's a scalable business. You've got you know what your sort of forecasts look like. It's a very different type of play. It does take time, especially with an earlier stage company, and defense procurement cycles are notoriously long. I guess in terms of how our sort of focus, we focus on Series A, Series B, where the technology is already proven. They might be deployed in one country. It's our job to then open doors, say in Germany or the United Kingdom. So they're already de-risked technologically and even militarily. But again, say technology that might work in Ukraine, a lot of great startups are deployed in Ukraine, might not necessarily translate to an order from the British MOD, for instance. So how we navigate that sort of that sweet spot where we're able to come in as sort of value-add investors, help them with going for procurement with primes or how to position for MODs or go for bigger EU sort of tenders. That's our positioning. So you're sort of looking at it from a venture lens and says the scalability is there, but it's very much a private equity play where you have a few contracts and it's basically our job to help them get more contracts. So it's a very stable play. And I think with exits, I don't really expect to see any IPO exits in this space. There hasn't been a dual use IPO in Europe in the last 10, 15 years. I don't know if even companies even listed in London. The liquidity just isn't there. But it'd be a very strong private equity play. Like sort of akin to what I saw in the US with the cyber market, where there's a lot of VCs and they were moved into sort of mid-market private equity and growth deals. With our sort of ecosystem in Europe, you're probably going to see specialist middle market private equity funds hoovering up defense tech companies, which have a couple of contracts. They've sort of hit term. They're not going to have that scalability or a venture style exit, but it's a very solid, stable business. So that's sort of the conversations we have with LPs. In terms of returns, we see the sort of big valuation jumps between a Series A round and a Series B round. So that's where we want to come in, open the right doors such that if they do want to go for a raise to really expand, say in North America, for our LPs, we've already captured that value from Series A to Series B in terms of pre-money valuations.
Look, I completely agree. I think that however you describe that Series A, Series B, growth, whatever fund, I think that's really at the moment the right space to invest, right? And I'm not saying there isn't needed pre-seed and seed, etc. That money is there. But I think there is critical money needed at that early stage. Products there, got some degree of contract with local military, etc. Want to expand. How do we do it? Type stage. I think that's the right play at this stage. I think you're very smart in thinking that the OEMs aren't going to pay venture multiples for acquisition. I think that would be nice. It might happen occasionally, but it shouldn't be the kind of main way of thinking about it. But then, as you said, stable buyer, that effectively can give you long-term financing. And that potentially also unlocks, for some companies, that will unlock a debt capability where they can actually then build the factory in Europe and then scale a true software, hardware type vertically integrated play, which again, that stable financing then potentially unlocks, which I think is super interesting. I think one of the things, and again, through some of the conversations I've already had so far, some of the people have said private equity kind of done the kind of, ward off symbol. And I think partly that comes from private equity's reputation of kind of asset strip, sell it on after a few years, it gets weaker over time. And they're like, wait a second, this is defense capability. It's got to get better over time, not weaker over time. So I think there's an interesting one. I've had some interesting conversations with people around kind of almost long-term strategic owners, almost like I'm going to make this up. So a Berkshire Hathaway of defense, right? That effectively owns a number of existing defense companies, holds them long-term and effectively operates them as kind of competing cousins, doesn't try and merge anything together, generates the value, but also then helps them redevelop the value. And I've heard that pitched a couple of times as kind of a different path to the private equity route. We'll need to do both. It's a market that's going to push that way. What do you think about that kind of holding structure model? Would that kind of resonate at all?
I mean, it's one of the ideas I was thinking about. I was talking to Matt about this. So how, as we scale the business, like we call it, like I say, it's a roll up. So there's so many different defense tech companies. There's so many different UXV platforms that we see, more similar than they are different. And the key differentiator in terms of getting procurement is not that your technology is slightly better. It's just if you're in early or you got the right contract, that's where the inefficiency comes in. You've got a stable business. I think for the sort of say the UXV market, for the companies that raise serious amounts of capital, they'd probably start acquiring other capabilities as an R&D function. I think the private equity play would be to acquire a mid-sized, growth-sized company, pour more capital into that company such that they can make earlier stage company acquisitions to bolster their own capabilities. So that's sort of how I see this sort of Berkshire Hathaway play, where it's a roll up where they're buying up differing technologies. And that's ultimately what's going to make the ecosystem much more efficient, where earlier stage companies are much more important because there's a clear exit route for them. For me, looking at it as an investor, there's a clear plan in terms of these guys having the right doors opened for the founders to know we can work with this big drone company, for instance. I think that's sort of how I see the sector. There's right now you're having loads and loads of different defense tech companies appearing. If in 2-3 years time, it'll be interesting to see how many still remain. My answer is maybe 20-30% will be gone.
Yeah,
some will be acquired, some will just run out of capital. So as a sector matures, it's going to be more of this roll up play. And this is exactly what I see in the US with cybersecurity. Initially, it was you're backing this innovative technology, you want to commercialize it or work with the government. Now you have so many different cyber companies that are more similar than they are different, that only the real winners have this capital and they can acquire other companies. Otherwise, the rest of them sort of just fail or run out of cash. The same thing will happen in the European defense system. I guess for myself as a GP, how I'd want to scale defense invest would then be to move into, say, growth equity or lower mid-market private equity, where as a defense tech company has a couple of contracts, stable for us, maybe you can probably structure a transaction with a debt facility, go for growth, and maybe we can open a few doors. Because they've already got cash coming in, it's a very different risk profile. And LPs is something that resonates more with LPs because we can raise a bigger fund. The risk, the sort of overall risk rate is it's a lot more efficient. Like it's easier for us to deploy large amounts of capital to these type of companies. So that's what's going to happen in the future.
Look, I think I completely agree. And I think these things have natural cycles. I actually spent a couple of years working in private equity. So it's a space I know in the US. So it's very familiar with that sort of area. I think the interesting one for us is going to be around the timelines for private equity. Right. And then those holding period. And this is where I'm channeling a bit more. Do you know the Constellation Group? The guys, so I'm channeling more of that vibe than I am on the PE side, simply because I think that the timeline holding periods for some of these defense companies and some of the countries that will depend on some of these defense capabilities will probably be longer on that side. Horses for courses. There will be a bunch of stuff happening in this market in this particular time. So, okay. So just in terms of the fund itself, you guys are still raised. Where are you up in terms of status levels that you can talk about?
Sure. Yeah, of course. So yeah, we're still raising. We've had a few productive conversations with a few prospective LPs. We hopefully intend to have the first closing, say Q1 of next year. And the full, and that's where we sort of intend to start deploying capital
Yep.
and hopefully have the full fund closed by Q4 next year.
Okay, and sorry, it's 50 million fund?
Correct, 50 million euro fund.
Okay, so 50 million, yes, because it's pan-European fund, despite English accent.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah.
Pan-European fund, pan-European fund, speaking in euros. That's fine. Okay, and hopefully first goes. That's fantastic on that particular side. And then just out of interest, at the moment, you are very much going, it's defense first. We talked about that earlier. Cyber a bit. I presume you've not put percentages to any of this. This is just like, okay, we're not going to spend 50% on this and 20% on this. It's much more of a kind of broad, let's invest in the best category leading company that we can find. And we don't really care where they are.
It's sort of a mixed approach. Our preference would be sort of UXVs or UXV adjacent technologies. So, for instance, AI object recognition or some sort of batteries type systems or materials. With the cyber part, again, from a pan-European lens, certain countries are better at certain technologies. For instance, France sort of dominate propulsion systems. The UK have been sort of particularly strong in cybersecurity. Estonia is very strong in software. So it really depends where we're looking at geographically in terms of where the allocation would be. And there's no clear set breakdown in terms of how we want to look at different technologies. It's just about finding, like to your point, the best technology that's ready deployed locally that we can then expand into other markets within Europe.
Absolutely. And just out of interest, how have you found the kind of prospective LP reaction? And I think this is a really interesting area. So I've just recorded, it hasn't come out yet, but I just recently recorded an episode on Bailey Gifford. So obviously based in Edinburgh, UK-based growth investor, arguably one of the best in the world. And part of that episode was unpacking their history from 1907 to 2025 and how they changed things over time. Long story, they've done a good job. Now, what was very interesting when you unpack the last 5 years is their attitude to effectively security in front of ESG. Right. So it's very much security enables democracy. If you don't have security, forget the rest of the acronym, because effectively it's not going to happen. And it was really interesting to unpack their defense story and their defense policies and their approach to responsible investing. And very occasionally when I'm chatting to various LPs, etc., we kind of run into kind of like we would, but kind of ESG, but when we're looking at it, but kind of conversations. It doesn't happen very often. Most people have already either flipped their policy or already refined their policy. Where are those conversations for you? Are you finding it's more like, oh no, we're good, we've got the mandate, we can go in, or oh yes, maybe 2028 if a miracle happens and the policy changes?
I guess I'd probably look at this ESG sort of play with this dual use concept. I like the idea of dual use where you have defense and commercial application. I do believe it's very much, it started off with the European Union saying, oh, we can't invest in defense, so it's called dual use. So there's commercial benefits even though it's really defense play. And then you had other sort of funds sort of jumping in on that bandwagon. I'm not against dual use. I think you should focus on one market and do it properly. Otherwise, you don't really have any business being in defense because it's very long procurement cycles. So my view is, if you're going to be in dual use, focus on defense, then you can go commercially. Otherwise, don't even focus on defense at all. Like, for instance, if you look at Palantir, they spent 8 years working with the DoD or with the US government before having the first commercial customer, Facebook. I think this dual use is not like you have to do both things at the same time. Just focus on one market, do it properly, and then maybe you can expand. In terms of LP conversations, defense is still very much, it is very much a no-no. If we're talking,
you still get that little kind of like,
yeah,
you get that. Okay,
it's just not. But it depends which region. So in the US, they're a lot more open to defense. I mean, the US has had a strong history of investing in defense only. They've got a whole private equity ecosystem. A lot more. There's a lot more constructive conversations about with LPs in the United States. In Europe, they've started becoming more open to defense, but I think even beyond these ESG, I guess the ESG sort of framework is more about, it's a very nascent ecosystem. How do you actually plan to exit? What is the strategy? Yeah. How do we get our returns? How are you guys going to look for liquidity? We sort of go in with that direction, saying we know these primes have these capabilities. We have these contacts over there. This is what they would be looking for. We have contacts in the United States where we know we can exit. So we talk about our returns in terms of this is how we can get liquidity. I think that's the biggest issue for LPs. Ultimately, LPs want IRR. The ESG becomes a secondary conversation. A lot of these, say, European Union or say sovereign limited partners is very much about what's the benefit to, say, the UK economy or the Dutch economy if it's the government partners. It's less about returns as well. So it really depends which investor group we're talking to. But in the institutional landscape, ESG is still important, and defense is very much a no-no. For instance, investing in Ukraine becomes very difficult because there's LPs think the corporate governance standards just aren't there compared to Europe. So even though the technology might be great in Ukraine, it's not an investable opportunity, and it's in a war zone. What's stopping a Russian attack on a facility, and you're as an investor, you lose your capital. So it's very much a balancing act, and it really depends on which investor group we're talking to.
And look, I really liked what you said there, which is effectively, it's not so much about the policy anymore. It's more about what am I looking for in terms of return? Am I sovereign and I'm looking for return in Estonia? Or effectively, I'm American and I'm looking for return in this particular sense. So that's better, because if we were stuck on it's the policy, policy says no, do not pass go, do not accept £200, then it would be super frustrating at that point. So I'm glad that it's evolved. So I'm very clear on dual use. I think that we've overhyped it, right? Or we've greenwashed it, or whatever phrase you want to do it. I think I'm much more comfortable with someone saying, we have a premium buyer or an urgent buyer that is basically dragging this product out of our company today, right? And they're in defense. Great. Fantastic. You developed the capability, that military can see it, and they're dragging it out of you. Fantastic. Or we developed a capability and the civilian, Airbus wants it, Airbus Aviation wants it, and they're dragging it out to me. I think it's so much better to think about that kind of urgent buyer who's really in love with your product, your service, your capability, and dragging it out. I think it's very hard to kind of serve, that would be the VC equivalent of saying, I've launched a company, we're doing B2B, B2C, all at once, and we're not going to run out of money, and our team isn't going to die. And every investor worth their salt is like going, don't you want to choose? Don't you want a chance of success at one of these things? Running a company is really hard, that sort of stuff. Okay, that makes perfect sense. All right, glad to see that but it's much more about the returns, which I think is where every investor is much more comfortable talking than the actual framing of the problem in itself. Okay, conscious of time, you've been amazing. So I want to kind of finish off with this kind of who do you admire question. I don't think this is a small ecosystem and everyone's collaborative, but I think it's really good to get a shout out for which founders do you admire? Obviously not the ones in stealth that you can't talk about. Or the secret founder, and which investors do you admire? So who is doing a great job in this nascent but really exciting ecosystem?
Sure. So in terms of companies I admire, there's a founder called Mark Whitfield. He's the founder of ARX Robotics. They were a German sort of drone company, and they've sort of moved into the UK. I think what makes me sort of admire them, that the whole sort of founding team were German army officers. They truly understood how to bridge military needs with sort of scalable commercial solutions. They expanded working with the UK MOD as well as being deployed in Ukraine. A lot of defense companies either focus on they focus on Ukraine, but that doesn't mean they'll deploy elsewhere. Mark Whitfield was able to do sort of both sides, had a very successful Series A raise. I see these guys sort of expanding into the North American market with a massive sort of Series B round. I think they navigated the landscape very, very well, and it's sort of a playbook of how you can be successful in defense tech. I sort of call them the sort of poster boy for defense.
And just out of interest, I think that's a brilliant shout out, and I'm a big fan as well. But why do you think they were able to navigate so well? Because it's not easy to be, that's the classic equivalent of not quite B2B, B2C, B2 blah, 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 but the equivalent of, we're going to launch in these 3 countries simultaneously. It'll be fine. Despite the fact that they're all regulated differently, different personalities, different landscapes, and different cultures, it'll work. Well, how do you think they navigated it well? Why did they do that? How did they do that?
Sure. So I guess the one interesting fact about the defense tech ecosystem is only 14% of companies have a military background. These guys all had military backgrounds, so they knew what was expected. They've been in the military. They know the day-to-day issues that soldiers go through. So they were able to create a solution that would actually work. They did very well in Germany. So they focused on their home market before realizing they can expand into other sort of NATO countries. They did very well in Germany. Then they had a raised focus on the UK. They were able to deploy in Ukraine. So it was very much a sequential approach. And they're differentiated, not only their military background, they understood what the soldier actually needed. Sometimes the best technology, again, is not something the soldier wants to use day in, day out. So that's something that's sort of the companies that we like to partner with, where they have a military background. And it's something that what differentiates us as GPs, that we're a military team. So that's, I think they had that balance that was right, and that's why they were able to do so well in Germany, expand into the UK, and they probably will expand into North America very, very soon.
Oh, look, I think that's a perfect point to end on. I think that there is a really important, great founders or great founding teams, because it's never really one person, know what to do in sequence and know what to parallelize. So which actions you can do in parallel, which actions need to be done in this particular order, and getting that sequence or moving to a parallel process is so important to navigate smoothly through those stages. Vishal, you've been amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm super interested to see how Defense Invest gets on. Hope, fingers crossed, whatever it is for or getting all those commitments pretty soon and doing your first investments. Thanks for coming on.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. To make sure you catch us again, please follow us on your favorite podcasting platform.